So.
I have no idea. But I've been trying to contact her. He hasn't returned my emails. So I thought I'd track him down. Student housing sometimes at the university. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so we're hoping to bring together a few grad days.
Well, you'll have my email address in this area. If you want to send me through the information, I co-chair the Inner West and City of Sydney area for the City Alliance, and that is essentially just a local area, and definitely use it. It's definitely a problem that doesn't get anywhere near enough airtime. Yeah, I've actually used to have friends who lived there, so I visited it myself.
We love the model.
I've actually just made contact with a group. They're promoting solution to the housing crisis. I don't know anywhere near enough in that area myself, so I'm intending on going to one of their meetings at some point in the future to actually get my head around what this is. In my mind, it could be a great thing, it could be a great thing. It probably depends on where the funds are going to be actually.
That's really interesting. It feels like a very old-fashioned concept.
For sure. This is funny.
Mine's 40 years. Yeah. Institution.
The place really well filled out, but health conditions as well. That is amazing. That's another major area. Is household energy and thermal. So improving the conditions of the housing people like renters who are at least slightly more and there's huge interest from climate change. In that area right now, so they've currently got an inquiry. So who's doing something? We've been pushing on for a fair while. It's finally coming to the breaking point. And, all right, we made it. Fine. Yeah, I mean, stand for that. Pivot for a while. Yeah, it's lovely area. It's probably getting in that direction. Yeah, a lot of it is still like New Canterbury Road is very long. For example, like we like one side is the outside of the road, so it's expanding houses that were probably built in the 80s.
Yeah.
So those still exist throughout a fair amount of stuff, but they've been doing some extra in recent years. The density rate is probably pretty there's a lot of opposition to having it go behind it, but I think maybe a kind of sensible spot where people need to sort of deal with the fact that we're in a process of doing it. It's going to be challenged. It shouldn't be like this. Yeah. Yeah. In West Council, there's rather housing policy. That's most so I'm encouraging as many people that in the area to write to council about their thoughts on that. Because, like most councils, there's an element of council and they've got some good things in the plan, but they can. There are a lot of greens in the US. One of my friends is one of the greens councils. They Labour has an absolute by about I think it's about 5. And so even though there's about 5 or so Greens in West Council, they actually can't do anything much. To ask you very frustratingly, you're all very centralised local government. It's not like that. It's
But interesting. Yeah. Female. No, she's
oh, amazing! I've followed Kate's video. She's into politics, and I'm so happy. She's very much she's in Wales Parliament. I remember, I think it's the last council for my big but in a West, last year got a really, really annoying deal where they didn't have a majority at that point, and so they made a deal with the party once council made this basically said we'll go into the mayor sharing arrangement with you, so like last year we were there. Only reason why we did that
you need to talk to an adult.
ever since I heard that, I was like, right, it's such. I think I probably felt as the Greens and so if we gave the Greens that same deal, they would get more policy and they would leave the votes for the next council election, which actually
yeah, no.
it's not political play, but
No,
it's
I understand the negatives. Where's the vote? Thank you.
Good evening. Yeah, go for it. I would like now to invite you to come and take a seat as we will begin the proceedings for tonight. My name is Dr. Bénédicte André. I'm the Associate Dean Students and Learning in the Faculty of Arts, and it's my great pleasure to invite you, to welcome you, rather, tonight on behalf of the Faculty of Arts for the first Arts After Dark event for 2026, Beyond the Build, Rethinking the Housing Crisis. Let's see how the caption goes with my accent. The Arts After Dark series is now in its fourth year, and it's fantastic to see such a great turnout tonight, and to see such a crosscut of the Macquarie community enjoying this event. We have our alumni from the Faculty of Arts, but also from areas across the university. We have industry partners from the Macquarie Park Innovation District, local council and businesses. I see current staff and students, and also students from local high schools. So it's really, really nice to see you all tonight. I know many of you in this room are returning guests, and maybe for others, it will be your first participation. So I hope you will all find tonight's proceedings enlightening and engaging. But before we proceed any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet tonight with a welcome to country.
Welcome. We acknowledge traditional custodians of Macquarie University land, a Waramatical clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured this land since the Dreamtime. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future. We welcome people of all nations and all faiths. Waidija, Jamna Payala Janvi. Come here, we speak together. We have 60,000 years of archaeological evidence of Aboriginal habitation at Lake Mungo and 20,000 years in Ryde. We have great antiquity. Today, hundreds of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people graduate from Macquarie University. The Darug Nation had famous leaders such as Chief Yarramundi, Narragansett, and Maria Locke. Many of the descendants of these Darug people live today amongst you. We celebrate with you our ongoing attachment and custodianship of this country. We celebrate the achievements of Macquarie University.
Right. So tonight's discussion will be centered around the topic of the impacts that the topics that we came to listen to has in almost every aspect of our daily lives. Planning informs the decision that we make for ourselves, for our families, for our futures, whether intentionally or subconsciously. And in the midst of an ongoing affordability and housing crisis, with frequent interest rates fluctuating and recent budget decisions, I think there are some big housing supply questions on the table tonight. So our panel this evening will bring together leaders from some of our faculty priority research centers across housing and urban research, global indigenous future, and environmental law. As the Associate Dean for Students and Learning, I'm particularly grateful to have some of our brilliant geography and planning students and alumni here tonight, who have helped bring the conversation to life this evening to life. So I hope you all enjoy the chance to connect and explore the topic with them. There's some fantastic activities and engaging stories on display at the back. And I want to also thank the volunteer for this evening, without whom it wouldn't have been possible. So I think they deserve a nice So I would now like to welcome to the stage our keynote speaker for this evening, Professor Christian Ramming, co-director of the Macquarie University Housing and Urban Research Centre. Professor Raming brings over 25 years experience in examining the social and structural challenges shaping Australian cities to our faculty, and we're very grateful for that. Through his research and communication, society and culture, and of course to the discussion with us here tonight. As co-director of the Centre, alongside our fellow panelist, Dr. Miriam Williams, he undertakes theoretically informed, solutions-oriented research, influencing policy and practice, and importantly, equally prioritizing social, economic, and environmental challenges facing urban citizens. Professor Raming also leads Macquarie's arm of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute Partner Network, responsible for the delivery of the National Housing Research Project. So this project is Australia's premier mechanism for funding, publishing and disseminating research on housing and homelessness, aiming to facilitate engagements between the research and the policy communities. Professor Raming will also be the moderator for tonight's discussion, and after his address, he will welcome his fellow panelists to the stage, Professor Spendy O'Sullivan, Dr. Miriam Williams, and Dr. Paul Govin. So thank you all very much for tonight, and I wish you a very pleasant evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. So before we get into the presentation, a few housekeeping matters to run through first. So in terms of some housekeeping, as always, if you could please turn your phone onto silent, that would be much appreciated. For those of you who might need the toilets and haven't found them already, they're behind the stage. Females are on this side, males are on that side. And should there be fire alarm, please note the emergency exit and follow staff advice. So those of you who have attended the Arts After Dark events before, the proceedings tonight is largely the same as previous. So I will be delivering the keynote address, after which I look forward to inviting my esteemed colleagues to the stage. They will each take a few minutes to introduce themselves and share their perspectives on the topics, and then we'll get into the panel discussion. After the panel discussion, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. And there are two ways to engage in that discussion, those questions and answer sessions. So there'll be roving microphones going around the audience, so feel free to put your hand up and ask a question. We will also have an online Q&A option for those who'd rather submit written questions than speak up. You can send me questions via the online link at any time during today through my keynote or the panel. So you can look at the QR code on the slide there, or go to Slido on your phone and enter in, which is 5517043. So that's the housekeeping. Just give me a second. Okay, from this slide. Okay, so we're here to talk about supply and housing. So in the context of a broader cost of living crisis, housing has come to dominate much of the public and policy debate in recent years. It is now widely accepted that we are in a period of housing crisis. When it comes to the question of how we respond to this crisis, the default response is often to just build more homes. Delivery of new housing supply has been championed as the solution by governments, development actors, and a growing number of the community, often identifying as yimbies, or not in my backyard groups. Focusing on New South Wales, tonight, primarily via this keynote, we'll explore how a crisis narrative has shaped recent policy interventions. And during the panel, we'll raise questions about how the long-term impacts of supply-focused response, the long-term impacts of this supply-focused response as our cities increase in density and in growing population. So let me start with the obvious. Housing is complicated. It is complex. And I'm not going to be able to cover everything in 15 minutes. However, it is simultaneously easily identified and difficult to define. Housing can be understood then more than just a building or a place to live. Housing provides the stability and security that underpin many of the social, cultural, and economic dimensions of individual and family life. In the Australian context, housing takes a wide variety of physical forms, ranging from one-bedroom apartments, detached family homes, rural acreages, to mobile homes on retirement villages. Housing is accessed through different tenure arrangements, including ownership, mortgage purchase, rental, shared accommodation, and informal provision free of charge. Or for many, the so-called Great Australian Dream of suburban home ownership, as exemplified by the work of artist Howard Ardley, represents lifestyle, freedom, identity, and egalitarianism. Shifts in political and economic priorities over the last 60 years or so have reconfigured the role and value of housing. The period of strong state intervention that followed the Second World War transitioned in a response to the rollout of neoliberal economic and policy agendas into a market-oriented system. The role of the state, increasingly unable or unwilling to provide housing, is now to enable the private sector. Relatedly, residential property has emerged as central to wealth creation and economic prosperity. For those able to purchase property, housing is now a financialised asset. Over the past 5 years, rents in the private sector have increased sharply, accompanied by record low vacancy rates. Access to social housing has remained limited due to restrictive eligibility criteria and long waiting lists, contributing to growing levels of housing insecurity and homelessness. Home ownership has become increasingly difficult to attain. Mortgage repayments have risen significantly following interest rate increases, with rapid house price inflation eroding affordability, particularly for first homeowners. And just to give you an example, at a national level, between 2018-19 and 2023-24, the median house price increased by 44%, or roughly $230,000. So since European occupation, the notion of the housing crisis has been used periodically to characterise housing challenges experienced by population groups or locations. However, since the COVID-19 pandemic, the housing crisis has been the dominant political concern as housing cost pressures have intensified and broadened, affecting growing numbers of households and with increased severity. The graph on this slide comes from a recent paper that myself and some colleagues have published, and it shows the significant increase in the prevalence of the term housing crisis or related terms in media coverage. At a national level, media articles mentioning housing crisis increased by approximately 1,120% over the period 2020 to 2024. In New South Wales, the increase was close to 2,600%. The graph also shows a significant increase in reference to housing supply over the same period. The increase in media coverage aligns with the broader public perception. In data collected as part of the Australian Cooperative Electorate Survey, most participants across all age groups agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that Australia is currently experiencing a housing crisis. According to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, the housing crisis has become, quote, a challenge facing Australians everywhere, and it needs action from every level of government. Nevertheless, as the second graph he suggests, public perceptions of the performance of the federal government in relation to housing, at least in the period leading up to the last election, was ambivalent at best, trending towards negative. And if you're interested in the full set of findings, this report can be downloaded from the webpage from the Centre for Housing and Urban Research here at the So typically referring to discrete events such as natural disasters, like the last day of Pompeii, crises relate to real observable changes in social, economic and environmental conditions, which threaten to impose negative outcomes on some or all members of society and require urgent response. In other words, crisis narratives are mobilised to signify a threat and to call for action. Despite many crises appearing to be natural, crises are also socially constructed, insofar as identifying changing conditions as a crisis involves interpreting those conditions and giving them meaning. Therefore, crises are political battlefields. A crisis framing is a narrative of the symptoms and causes of the crisis and how they could be solved. While crises can offer opportunities to challenge the status quo, they often function to entrench existing policy positions. For example, property developers and their lobby groups have been quick to adopt the housing crisis in their efforts to influence policy. Despite being commonly attributed to Winston Churchill, the quote, "Never waste a crisis," does not come from the British wartime Prime Minister. Rather, the phrase has its origins with the Italian Renaissance philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. More contemporary usage follows Rahm Emanuel, Barack Obama's chief of staff, who, when discussing the 2008 financial crisis, argued, quote, "You never want a serious crisis to go to waste." No matter what its origins, the phrase has come to be used to describe those opportunities that arise in the face of crisis. In emphasising a state of emergency, crisis narratives draw attention to the perceived shortcomings of existing policy arrangements, thereby creating the policy space for interventions that would be unlikely to gain traction in normal circumstances. While I'm not here to provide analysis of the recent federal budget, proposed reforms to negative gearing and capital gain tax can be understood as responses made possible by the housing crisis. Similar reforms were widely viewed as contributing to the Labor Party's defeat in the 2019 federal election, suggesting that it'd still be difficult to get through an election process at the moment. The framing of housing as an urgent crisis has altered the political landscape, creating opportunities for governments to pursue more interventionist and politically contentious measures. In this context, the perceived need for immediate action can help justify policy responses that may otherwise have been considered electorally untenable. So in the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to focus on another example of crisis-enabled policy intervention, centering on housing supply and the planning system. In adopting a basic neoclassic interpretation of markets, it is argued that the lack of housing supply relative to demand is the main determinant of price. At a national level, the importance of new supply as a housing crisis response is evidenced through the National Housing Accord. The Accord establishes a national target of 1.2 billion homes by 2029. Under the Accord, New South Wales has a target of 370,000 dwellings, or roughly 75,400 dwellings a year. In short, new supply is defined as the solution to the housing crisis. In New South Wales and across Australia more broadly, the planning system has repeatedly been identified as the key cause of the housing crisis. This diagnosis draws on a long-standing argument that state regulation constrains housing supply and contributes to rising housing costs. Local government planning processes are particularly criticised as delaying development approvals and resisting rezonings that will be needed for growth. The planning system is portrayed as reactive. It is seen to distort market efficiency and limit private sector responsiveness. The proposed solution is relatively straightforward: deregulate planning, increase housing supply, and improve affordability through expanded market-led housing production. The New South Wales planning system has long been characterised as overly complex, with successive governments looking to fix the system through processes of simplification and codification. Planning system reform has been the favoured policy response to governments looking for ways to solve the housing crisis by challenging housing supply challenges by altering land use zone and development assessment. In the lead up to and in the period since the 2023 state election, the Labor Party has pursued an ambitious planning reform agenda. A series of reforms have been introduced since 2023, including changes to the underlying legislation. It's not possible here to review all of those changes, but I will very briefly mention two. So the first is the Transit-Oriented Development Program, which was introduced without any consultation and identified 39 precincts across Sydney, Newcastle and Wollongong for intensified development. The program increased permissible development heights, floor space ratios, encouraged mixed use, apartment development and introduced new open space standards, with the New South Wales government claiming that it would deliver up to 230,000 new homes. The second one is the low and mid-rise housing policy, which focused on 171 centres permitting high density housing forms in low density residential zones, while offering a fast track assessment for developments that use standardised designs produced through the New South Wales Housing Pattern Book. This policy is claimed to provide an additional 112,000 homes. While presented as responses to the housing crisis, recent reforms have sidelined several objectives and processes traditionally central to planning and urban development, creating the potential for significant long-term consequences. In the next two slides, outline 5 challenges associated with supply-focused reform agendas, and here I draw on insights from projects conducted with local planning offices. So first of all, the reforms often lack strategic alignment. The location and scale of new housing does not necessarily correspond with existing state or local strategic plans, undermining the forward-looking nature of strategic planning and destabilising long-term visions for urban development. Second, reforms weaken the democratic foundations of the planning system, justified by the urgency of the housing crisis. They frequently curtail consultation and participation opportunities for councils and local communities. Third, broad brush zoning policies often overlook local conditions and constraints. Environmental limitations, including flooding and sensitive ecological areas, may restrict development regardless of the zoning changes. Blanket rezonings can fail to account for the existing land uses, with housing supply assigned to sites occupied by heritage buildings, schools, religious institutions, and other sites unlikely to ever be developed. Fourth, reforms do not necessarily align with development feasibility. Just because something is rezoned doesn't mean it will be developed. The development process is complex, with borrowing costs, labour and material availability, current market conditions, amongst other things, influencing private sector development decisions. Thus, taken together, issues of site constraints and development feasibility reveal that the housing supply targets are at best aspirational, at worst complete works of fiction. Fifth, the emphasis on housing supply raises concerns about the long-term infrastructure provision. Although concentrated growth in designated centres aligns with compact city principles, many centres lack the infrastructure capacity needed to support significant increases in population. At the same time, limits on infrastructure contributions reduce the ability of governments, local government primarily, to fund necessary upgrades, creating the risk of infrastructure shortfalls and diminished urban outcomes over time. So planning reform in New South Wales has been framed as the solution to the housing crisis by creating the planning system, by casting the planning system as the principal barrier to housing supply. This narrative has legitimised the reassertion of state authority, centralised decision making, and prioritised housing delivery targets over place-based planning and broader planning objectives. While politically effective in demonstrating decisive action in response to a crisis, these reforms have subordinated concerns related to infrastructure, urban quality, environmental outcomes, and democratic participation. Moreover, persistent challenges, including construction costs, labour and material shortages, financing conditions, builder insolvencies have limited new supply, while housing costs have continued to rise, suggesting a disconnect between the crisis-driven reform narrative and their capacity to actually improve affordability. While framed as a response to the housing crisis, the pursuit of rapid new housing supply is not the silver bullet many claim it is. And I look forward to discussing some of the long-term implications and challenges of this approach with my colleagues in the panel. Thank you. So I'm also the moderator, so I do have to switch hats quickly. Okay, is this working? Yes, so I'd like to now take the opportunity to invite my colleagues to the panel up to the stage so we can discuss in a little bit more detail some of the issues I've touched on. So first of all, I'd like to invite Professor Sandy O'Sullivan to the stage. So Professor Sandy O'Sullivan is a graduate person in a leadership role in the Centre of Critical Indigenous Studies and is the Director of Research and Innovation at the Macquarie University Global Indigenous Future Research Centre. Their current work on the Dignity Project explores loneliness, housing and community access for older Indigenous LGBTQI+ people and other underserved communities. Secondly, I'd like to invite Dr. Miriam Williams, who is the co-director of the Housing and Urban Research Centre and also in the School of Communication, Society and Culture. Her work is at the forefront of urban care research and geography, examining how practices of care through public space, food initiatives and everyday social relations can make cities more livable. And finally, I'd like to invite Dr. Paul Govern to the stage. Paul comes from Macquarie University Environmental Law Research Centre and is a senior lecturer in environment and planning law in this Macquarie University School of Law. He's a specialist in how planning law can promote changes in how people value their environment. So what we're going to do now is each of the panelists are going to give a short talk on their topics and their interests, and then we'll go into a series of conversations and questions before opening it up to the floor. So, Sandy.
Over to me. Thank you. That was an amazing presentation. Just an incredible stuff. Just wanted to start by saying that really appreciate your leadership in this space. So I'm an Aboriginal person, graduate person, and I work in the Centre for Critical Indigenous Studies here on the Wallumbilla campus. I also work on the Dignity Project and focusing on older queer people. And housing precarity is never far from people's minds, of course. So we're here on Darugura, in a place where many Darug people can't afford to live on their own. I think we do need to stop simply doing performative land acknowledgements and move on to calls for land back and reparations. And we need to consider the real difference between supply and access. So, look, many of you will have heard the term close the gap, and some of you will know it intimately. CTG started 19 years ago, so we're coming up to the 20th anniversary of the failures of Close the Gap. It's aimed at eliminating the inequality between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. It's got these markers that are set. The markers are somewhat problematic and they're set as targets that are never met. So they have until 2021 to do the first 10-year approach to setting targets and fail to meet any of them. We've got another 5 years. We're 5 years into the current targets being set. We've got another 5 years to go. Productivity Commission suggests that we're not going to meet the 2031 target and potentially not a 2041 target either, particularly regarding housing. But of 17 current targets, they might meet 4. That was also 5 years before the last one. So the ones that focus on housing, the one that focuses on housing, and arguably all of them focus on housing, housing matters, has been a problem because it effectively fails to recognise where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live. So it's set as people can secure appropriate affordable housing that is aligned with their priorities and need, which sounds broad an approach, but then becomes highly specific and then unmet. So it actually affects 9% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people because it only talks about people who are in remote and very remote communities. Now, the reality of our own living situation is that the vast majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, 60% of Indigenous people live in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria in urban settings, not covered in Close the Gap, arguably, not specifically covered. So people can secure appropriate affordable housing that is aligned with their priorities and need, but they're not. They're not getting there. There is one area of housing that has improved its supply across the lifespan of Closing the Gap: incarceration numbers. And this is just absolutely outrageous. So I move on now, thinking about older people in housing. There's research by Peter Anderson and Levon Blue, and I wanted to raise this here because I want you to be thinking, I want us to be thinking about what this means in terms of housing. It shows startling statistics that the majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will not live to access the age pension. In their conversation piece, it was called "Too Many Indigenous Australians Die Before Getting to Claim the Age Pension. We Need to Make Retirement Fairer." They talked about the median age at death of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of all genders as 63, 67 to get the age pension. For non-Indigenous people, it's 82. When we think about housing, our aged services housing figures continue to reflect better than actual outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people when examined as a raw figure, because we continue to die younger. I could go on, talk about the failure of policy and Housing Australia Future Fund and its over-reliance on the distribution to IDA, but I'm just going to finish there for now and hopefully revisit some of these ideas about what stats we need in place.
Thank you, Sandy. So over to Miriam.
Thank you, Sandy. Thanks, Christian. I'm going to be talking about something beyond the housing tonight, to think about public spaces which are central to our wellbeing and connection to each other, and also place. And what I'm talking about comes out of research that I've been doing with Professors Kate Lloyd, Donna Houston, Associate Professor Justine Lloyd, funded through an ARC linkage project with the New South Wales Government on the power of public spaces to connect people and place. You may have seen our booth up the back. We've got some great merch, stickers, postcards. Fill out our survey. That's a shameless plug. So we want to hear from you about places that matter to you. So this research project has been happening for a number of years now. And we've been looking at public spaces as the streets, parks, squares, public libraries, and cultural institutions that make up our neighbourhood. But they are also the overlooked in-between places and leftover spaces, disused laneways, verges, and footpaths. And they are the more expansive parks, reserved playgrounds, rivers, and open and recreational space that comprise our places. They are important habitat and the social heart of cities, and in the Australian context, they are always country. Public spaces are not just discrete pockets of state-owned land. They are also networked and relationally connected by streets, lanes, and footpaths if you're lucky. They don't always have access to the footpaths. So as part of this project, we've been thinking about public spaces as an infrastructure of care, which is a term my collaborators, Associate Professors Emma Power and Kathy Mee, developed to talk specifically about housing. Infrastructures of care shape how care is made possible. They are comprised of the built form, of policy and planning arrangements, and also economic practices that enable people to care for each other and others. So we all need care at some point in our lives, and homes are really important places of care. But practices of care don't just take place in homes. They also take place in neighbourhoods, especially in dense neighbourhoods. Care is an ordinary and everyday practice that happens everywhere, including public spaces, which can be managed and designed in ways that make care more or less possible. So to understand public spaces as infrastructure of care is to recognise ordinary, everyday public spaces as sites that have the potential to care for care, give care, receive care, mediate care, but also mediate carelessness. People can experience public spaces as exclusionary, as unjust and uncaring. And that is often how scholars also look at care, as a concept to help us reveal how these spaces are diversely experienced and highlight how we might design spaces better to care. So the ways we design our cities in terms of streets, public spaces, social infrastructure provisioning, accessibility of green space all matter in terms of our capacities to care well. And so if we take a care-informed approach, we may recognise how different amenities, such as, or physical elements of public space, like benches, shade, toilets, footpaths, access to drinking water, are really important for people's capacities to care. And they help us understand how public spaces become what Vinay and colleagues call key resources we require for care. And so last year I was fortunate enough to go to Europe to do some field work in Barcelona with my collaborator, Associate Professor Romina Bradella from Surbiton University in Stockholm. And we've been looking at the innovative work that Barcelona has been doing in developing infrastructure to support paid and unpaid caregivers through planning practice. And we were looking at and interviewing the people involved in the government, but also NGOs, activist organisations who were highlighting and making care as a concern. Care is also positioned as a crisis. It's another different crisis. We're not talking about that today, but it's also something that people have really become aware of since the COVID-19 pandemic, this crisis in care. So like Sydney, many cities in Europe are also experiencing this housing crisis. Barcelona in Spain is no exception. But alongside the crisis in housing, they have been creating new public spaces. And we can see this in the example of the Barcelona superblocks. Who has heard of the Barcelona superblocks? Hands up, a couple of people? Okay, fabulous. So when I was there, I went to see some of the superblocks. And the practical layout of each superblock varies, but really it's a grid of 9 blocks that were previously separated by cars. They've combined through traffic calming measures. Essential streets are no longer accessible to cars in some cases. They've lowered the speed limits and they've created new public spaces, parks, playgrounds, community gardens. There's lots more benches to sit at. Sand bits. They've created different spaces to support biodiversity and pollinators. But Barcelona had to retrofit these public spaces into the existing incredibly dense built form. In order to create these new public spaces, they recognised how important public space is for community connection and well-being in terms of biodiversity, but also climate adaptation. And so the super blocks policy has expanded to create new, not just blocks, but also what's called green access corridors to support biodiversity, to assist with climate adaptation. And in their new caring city policy, they are aiming to provide other types of infrastructures, more change facilities for babies, and develop further playgrounds suitable for children with autism to, and I quote, develop public spaces that facilitate care for the people who receive and provide it. So public spaces are sites of connection. They can support well-being, they provide habitat, they play a key role in climate change adaptation, and they need to be considered an essential part of the housing solution from the outset. Considering the physical public space infrastructures people need to care for themselves and others well can be a really useful perspective that helps us understand how care is not just practiced inside homes, but is reliant upon infrastructures and relational networks. So the specific elements that facilitate public spaces being experienced as caring or as having the resources needed to support care matter now and into the future. So when we build housing, we need to make sure we do so in a way that doesn't lose sight of the important role public spaces play as infrastructure for care.
Thank you, Miriam. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Christian. Evening, folks. I'm just going to talk briefly about the recent changes to the planning laws in New South Wales that Christian outlined in his keynote from an environmental perspective. I feel that when we talk about crisis, the housing crisis, we may have missed an opportunity to understand how a housing crisis relates to other crises that we are currently facing, particularly climate change and biodiversity loss. This points to the need, I believe, that housing, however we want to describe housing, needs to be sustainable housing. Now, sustainability is a term which I think we all are familiar with. It's a ubiquitous term. We all might have slightly different understandings of it, but the law has a fairly clear articulation of this term. And I think it's important to remember that the planning laws in New South Wales under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act of 1979, the recent amendments promotes the accelerated supply of housing. Now, another object of that legislation is sustainable development, or as we say in Australian law, ecologically sustainable development. And there is nothing in the legislation to say that one object must take preference over another. For many years, at least from the early 90s, environmental law in Australia has been directed towards sustainable development. And I think it's incredibly important now that when we look at the housing crisis, we look at the quality of housing, we look at the location of housing, we look at the occupants of those houses and how those people will rely upon the environment that's around them in order to find sustenance, comfort, health, well-being, etc. The speed with which housing supply will be accelerated under the recent planning law reforms greatly risks marginalising a number of important environmental considerations and protections that have existed under planning law for many years. One example is the Housing Delivery Authority, which some of you I'm sure are familiar with. The Housing Delivery Authority is a relatively new body, a relatively new addition under the Planning Act. Its role is basically an advisory body to the Planning Minister. How it works is that if a developer has an idea for housing, they can approach the housing development authority, submit this proposal. The housing delivery authority will look at this proposal and could advise the minister that this is something which needs to be fast-tracked, essentially. Now, the fast-tracking works with regard to a certain development pathway or development process, one of several under the Planning Act. But this particular development pathway, known as state significant development, is hugely influential now in how the government has set itself to deliver more rapid housing supply. The problem, though, with SSD, state significant development, is that it is fast-tracked. It often operates in a way that it will overlook or be exempt from certain environmental controls. Another area that in more recent implementation, this only happened, I believe, 2 weeks ago. Expansion of another development pathway, which many of you may be more familiar with. You may even use this development pathway, self-complying development. Another form of development, another development pathway which is controlled by the state rather than local planning authorities and councils. The expansion of complying developments, again, will include more developments which are aimed at accelerating housing supply. The problem with complying development, though, from the perspective of sustainable housing, is that complying development is exempt from many of the biodiversity and climate controls that exist at a local planning level. So over time, if we have housing supply which is accelerated through these two areas of planning, or these two planning pathways rather, what we risk is an override of those very instruments which have been designed and operated for many years that are in place to enable sustainable housing, enable sustainable development. So this correlation, I think, between these changes, the changes to housing supply and the decline of these environmental protections is one that I believe has been overlooked, maybe deliberately, maybe somewhat by accident. And we only need to look really to the UK, a very similar jurisdiction in terms of planning laws, in terms of environmental laws, to see how the response there to the housing crisis, again, as Christian said in his presentation, a overemphasis, maybe over-indexing on housing supply, has resulted in the dismantling of many very innovative and progressive protections for biodiversity. Now, in Australia, or New South Wales, more to the point, is going the same direction. I think we're going to find, maybe not next year or 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever, that the very idea, the idea of applying sustainable development to housing and this concept of sustainable housing is one that is not going to be achieved. Now, what does that mean for intergenerational equity? In light of the recent budget that we all, I think, are across, there's been a huge devotion, I think, in that debate to intergenerational issues. Some say it's not intergenerational equity at all. And that sort of interested me because on the one hand, I think that's something we need to discuss. But on the other hand, if the notion of sustainable housing is completely marginalized, then intergenerational equity and the relevance of that, I think, is more pointed towards how this rapid supply of housing is going to be implemented within environmental constraints. And those constraints are getting tighter and tighter with each passing year. So, yeah, thank you. That was something that I wanted to add to the debate.
Thank you very much, Paul. So, some really interesting cross-cutting themes there, I think, amongst us all. So, what I might do is take the opportunity to ask one question of each of our panelists before opening it up to the floor more broadly. I might work backwards. I might start with you, Paul, if that's okay. So, you've outlined that, the loss of sustainability is one of the potential risks of these reforms in response to the crisis. How can they be better addressed? Like, what needs to be done to incorporate to address those issues moving forward?
Yeah, I think one thing that we can do to address sustainability and sustainable housing moving forward is first of all understand why it's important. Now, the idea of placing people in areas which are already at disproportionately high risk of environmental change, that is something immediately which I think has to be central to any positioning of housing. And it might seem fairly common sense, but we have a history in Australia of housing being put in flood-prone areas. Now, we might not want to repeat that, obviously, but the chances that we will do so, I think, are not something, again, we can take for granted, because climate change means this risk is changing all the time. The other one, of course, is bushfire. Now, I spoke to someone at Blue Mountains Council last year who said to me they were very concerned that a housing development being approved under the SSD pathway, which, as I just remind everyone, overrides all local planning controls, that this development was to be put in a bushfire-prone area. So it seems to me that what is being overlooked here is perhaps context is one thing, and how context needs to be brought in, I think, more strongly in terms of where do we actually want to ensure that we have quality housing, going back to my point about sustainable housing. The other point I touch upon briefly as well is a related idea that in New South Wales, there is at the moment debate about a human rights instrument being introduced into New South Wales law, which would be the first human rights instrument we've ever had in New South Wales. And one of the provisions under this proposal is adequate housing. And so I think we need to ask ourselves, what does adequate mean in this context? And I think sustainable housing, housing that is designed, envisioned for the well-being and safety and health of people, is incredibly important. And we mustn't lose sight, I think, of the relevance that environmental risk will always disproportionately affect people who are already at risk. And this could include people in lower socioeconomic areas. This could include older people, children, etc. So I think, just to go back to Christian's question, I think how do we do it from here? I think it's a question of perhaps building stronger strategic plans and ensuring that strategic planning is taken into account and is reflected in the assessment process with regards to housing projects, be it under state significant development or any other pathway.
Thank you very much, Paul. So Miriam, one of the outcomes of a focus on housing prices, increased supply, is ultimately increased density, and a much larger portion of the population living in apartments of very high density dwellings that may not have their own open space or outdoor space, backyards, and so forth. So what role then does public space play in terms of cities that need to house more people in high density living?
So as we've seen in some of the really dense neighbourhoods we're already seen in Sydney, it means that open public space is in high demand. So you have more likely to have greater conflicts over the use of public space for different reasons. We know that people require access to green space for a whole range of reasons. Exercise is a key one, but also places to gather. There's quite a lot of difference between how some apartments are designed to others in terms of their capacity to house families for gatherings, whether or not they have a communal barbecue space or a space to gather in larger family groups, which is still a really important thing that we do. And so there's this difference in terms of quality of housing or dense housing, in terms of the types of facilities and amenities that are provided in particular particular apartment complexes, particularly if you look at price, where they're located, etc. And then also, there's a real difference in terms of places in Sydney in terms of access to quality public space that have important amenities. So as more and more people move into neighbourhood, there are certain activities we like to do outside. And where do we do them? We do them in public open spaces. So what I think is a really important part of the conversation is ensuring that we have sufficient provision of public open space coupled with housing in these dense neighbourhoods, particularly when there are neighbourhoods that are being developed at a really fast rate and there's a lag in terms of infrastructure provision. So that is another thing that we see in some neighbourhoods is that they're developing, but the infrastructure, the community infrastructure, the public libraries, the parks, the playgrounds for children aren't provided when they need to be, and they take quite a long time to actually come on board, and that really does impact people's sense of connection to the neighbourhood, but also quality of life in particular places.
Thanks, Mary. Just to reflect on my presentation, I think the push to reduce development contributions to facilitate the feasibility of new supply obviously has implications in terms of those kind of things as well. And Sandy, you mentioned a lot in your introductory comments, but one of the things you mentioned was the fact that most Indigenous Australians live in cities, which are incredibly expensive, and many additional can't live on country, afford to live on country. How can we provide housing and supply for those urban populations?
I think recognising it to begin with. I mean, I think part of it is we're frequently not included in the we. You know, I'd say if it's a challenge, let's say, who's the we? Does it include Indigenous communities? I know the answer to that is yes, but it's an expansive way of thinking because it's, you know, what we need, want, and are required to do in terms of caring for the country is different. Many of us don't live on our own country. You know, I'm Wiradjuri, I don't live on my own. And so that relationship is a strange one as well. It's often not accommodated in the line from government providing supply into communities. And it's not recognising where we actually live. I mean, the reason again, the whole who was the we, one of the reasons I kind of laughed when you said there's never been a human rights aspect of New South Wales legislation. That's not true. You know, there has been. It's just not a positive human right. I mean, I was born before 1967, so I can tell you that I was subject to particular restrictions by this state, and that is a restriction of human rights. But again, it's not considered. You know, this complexity. I'm not just trying to throw out these moments and elements as the kind of grab bag of things that need to be addressed. You know, Close the Gap is around real inequity. It's around what it means to not have access. I think about disability access in terms of public spaces, and it's often enough. And in great councils, and we're very lucky to have a great council here, you know, there is a lot of reparation happening around that. You know, a recognition that it's not always been front and centre. This is, you know, these are key issues, but we continue to be grafted on. So what fixes it is putting it into the Close the Gap. I mean, Close the Gap has its problems, but it is around it. And it's around recognising inequity. So providing, you know, think about the remarkable tiny sliver of an idea that Nightingale Housing had to charge $100 a year under their corporate fees that goes to land back movements. I mean, $100 a year. And believe me, there would be an outcry if that was, you know, if you didn't charge the great lands. But actually, what's happening at the moment is it's much more than that going into other kinds of fixing up issues rather than us being in central decisions about where we live, what we really need, and you know what that looks like. And I'm really worried about the gaps in the Close the Gap. they continue to be chasms. So we do need to look at it. I think we all need to be asking ourselves in our work and in our lives whether we're doing what we're doing is making housing more affordable for all underserved communities. And, you know, obviously my concern is older people and middle person, but, you know, I think about the limitations that we begin to have, the idea of aging in place, the idea of being supported by community, and it largely assumes provision of housing. You know, it largely does this work that assumes a kind of middle class access to spaces. It assumes time that people have, and you know, and ideas of leisure that are really shared. And so the more complexity that we have in the industry.
Thanks very much, Sandy. I think if nothing else, we've renamed to close the gap to closing chasms. So that's nice. So what we might do now is move into a bit of more open conversation, Q&A session with questions from the audience. So as I mentioned, we will have some roving mics, I think, that people can access. Gemma's going to give me iPad and the other question on it. Okay. Okay, so the first one here is strict eligibility was cited as a reason for social housing being difficult to access. What are the criteria that prevented people from accessing the social housing waiting list? So I think that's probably, I'll just grab that one. It's not, there's no issue with people accessing the waiting list. The issue is accessing the house. So we have a system in New South Wales, but across Australia, where increasingly access to social housing is being restricted to those most in need. People suffering domestic violence, people with severe health issues, for example, and essentially these priority programs put them to the front of the queue as they should be. But what that means is that other people that are on that list keep getting bumped down the list. So I think it's pretty standard now for waiting lists across all of New South Wales to be in the order of 10 plus years to get into social housing. So yeah, get on the list if you can't get the housing. And I think there's a whole set of new policy programs designed to provide more public housing and social housing, community housing through the redevelopment of current public housing estates. So the governments are arguing that redeveloping public housing estates, Waterloo's one that's in the news at the moment, Ivanhoe Estate was located opposite the university here, being redeveloped as mixed-use developments. But the question we need to ask is, do they still provide enough social public housing? This is government land, and I think there's certainly an opportunity to build more housing.
This is the issue, isn't it? I mean, this is the exception to the supply problem, and that's that there simply isn't enough. And, you know, and there isn't a will to create more. And I'd argue, you know, Housing Australia Future Fund has agreed to think about this. And instead of developing policy, it's just pushing, you know, and I mean, it should be doing this work. It should be doing the work that we're doing. And it should be commissioning that work to really understand what can happen, what can be related, what's happening elsewhere, and what we can start to really bridge to make this kind of housing be an option. Because again, I mean, I know from the communities that I work with, this is the solution for people. And it's a solution not when it's just in one place. It's a solution when it's expansive across the community. And you know, that's not the interest.
Okay. So this one's for Miriam. How do we retrofit cities to be careful when planning is ultimately an impingement on private rights?
Very interesting question. I've been thinking about careful cities for a long time now. And I think part of it is the participatory element as being one, and I think that connects nicely to what people have been talking about in terms of how we do involve communities in decision making. So some of the work that's being done, led by United Cities and Local Government, which is like a global organisation connected to the UN, they've been doing a whole work on caring cities and care as an aspiration and infrastructures of care. And part of some of their, it's been listening to the members of those organisations, having conversations about what they need, learning from each other. So that's part of it. The retrofit question is really interesting because some cities have adopted caring city strategies that are trying to address the ways that people who are living, relying on care. So there's a lot of communities, particularly I'm thinking of the example of Bogota in Colombia, they have care blocks as well, where they recognised that a lot of unpaid care workers were having no time for respite. They used planning strategy to locate care centres that would provide them with some respite, along with other things, education access, care for the carers, a whole range of different, and also redistribute the care burden so that the other partners in society who don't always take care or they don't know how to care are educated in order to know how to do that work as part of their strategy of cultural transformation. They located these places in very central neighbourhoods, community centres, using community infrastructure that already existed. They resourced it well. They played a really significant role in actually engaging with what people wanted and what they needed. So that was sort of a planning intervention that's been happening in Bogota in Colombia in order to address the issue around the needs of paid and unpaid care workers. So yes, you can retrofit it, but you have to value care. And that's part of the thing. It needs to be something you actually consider in planning. It needs to be the needs of planners, the needs of carers actually needs to be considered and needs to be something that we think about when we design new developments, when we think about the resources that are needed for care.
Thank you. We might go to the audience. Is there anybody that wants to ask a question? There's one down here.
So just listening to everyone and thinking. So when looking at solutions, there was this mention of we need to consider care in our new developments. We need to think about sustainable development, and we need to think about a consideration for underprivileged groups and for Indigenous people and all this. But if we're applying that, seems to me almost like there needs to be a almost more cohesive look at all of these different elements in designing of housing, supplying of housing, and with more past few decades sort of neoliberal introduction where housing kind of has taken, government has taken sort of a further step back from housing and social provisions and a lot of different services. You have so many different services scattered amongst so many different groups, but we need to have this more holistic approach while at the same time having local communities think about place. How do we kind of have that? How do we sort of close that gap between thinking about all these many smaller issues and community things while having a larger cohesive thought towards housing across the state, across the country?
I think one of the great question. It's the question of the ages, and the answer is actually really simple. The government could do it. Again, this is my criticism of Housing Australia Future Fund is it's limited, but it's limited by design. But its function is to really think about some of those. Again, if you'll excuse the very gaps. You know, it is to recognise that most people fall into that unless they have privilege, unless they have agency, unless they're hitting all of the marks as individuals. You know, it's not assured. And for underserved communities, and I tend to use the term underserved because it's actually our responsibility to make sure communities are served. And there needs to be not a kind of rumbling resentment about provision, which we know is what's happening. It comes across in the media. There is this push, and it's been affected politicians as well. So there's this push to suggest that, for instance, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, that we want something that other people don't get. Actually, we want something that other people do get. We'd love to link aid to, you know. And I think these are real and tangible things. I think we need to remember that there's people behind this as well, you know, that that we need to hear stories from those people and how they live, and try and see that this needs to be solutions based. I think councils are often very front and centre with that, but they're not the ones who make these decisions in our structure. And so I think that does have a huge impact. You know, I often think about, you know, when I talk about things like the age of when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people die, it's the median age. It doesn't mean, you know, you're going to die at that age. But the reality is, it's stark, but it's still theoretical, you know, until you think about actual people. And I think about my brother, who actually started the Dignity Project, who died at 62. I think about my sister, who died younger than me at 60. I think of these, you know, real people who struggled their whole lives, and we're not trying to get something other people can't get, but we're trying to have that equitable space and field. And so trying to position that hearts and minds is a big part of the problem. You know, that's why there's not an easy answer. It's not just this, you know, this government setup that creates that opportunity. It's also, you know, really recognising that people fall in the gaps because others will.
Just one comment. In terms of cohesion and having a broader plan, there was something which would have been, I think, incredibly relevant to sustainable housing. There was a regulation, proposed regulation some years ago, called, Christian, you might remember this, the Design in Place set. Yeah. So SEP is just an acronym for State Environmental Planning Policy. So a legally binding regulation. Yeah, so it's called the Design in Place set. And it was largely, I think, welcomed and celebrated. The idea of the set was basically to create greener, healthier living for people, particularly in the urban context. So how a set basically works is that it applies to the entire state. So any housing development presumably would have come under this set as well, and would have had to have aligned with these values and objectives. Unfortunately, the set never actually entered law. The idea was shelved and deleted from the record, quite literally. So that would be, yeah, my answer to the response to the question, but I just want them to know how that would pan out.
Thanks, Paul. I know there are other questions from the audience, but one a question that we, to be honest, we kind of anticipated was, you know, a question about the current changes in the government in terms of the adhering changes to capital gains tax and other schemes such as the government help to buy scheme. And I think this relates to the question, is that all of these things are done in isolation. I think Australia doesn't have a housing policy, and that is a real gap in terms of delivering these, addressing these problems, because things are done as one-offs. You know, there's a change to the capital gains, there's a new funding mechanism introduced. store or something like this, there's absolutely no coherency or coordination. So I think the lack of a coherent housing policy, which is not just the national target of 1 to 2 million homes, has the potential to overcome, well, at least address some of those issues. In terms
or acknowledge them. You know, I mean, it has to regard them. You know, it has to get that it exists in that space, which all of these siloed processes don't.
Indeed, I think perhaps there is some subconscious recognition that they exist, but I mean things like capital gains and housing supply and rezonings and all of these kind of things, they're made by different people for different purposes, different outcomes, and the relationship between them aren't well understood and aren't kind of addressed very well in policy. So, I mean, I think in terms of negative gearing and capital gains tax, I 100% believe that is a response to the housing crisis, and the government has used the current situation opportunistically to bring in those policy responses. And again, they're not the silver bullet. They're not going to make a huge difference overall, but they might help some. But again, if there are other policies and changes that introduced as well, right to buy and help to buy schemes, shared equity programs, again, they will help some in terms of accessing property. But by themselves, they're not a solution. But if anybody else wants to have comment on taxation and capital gains, they can give you. No? Okay, I know there was another question down the front here that we're going to get. We might get that one.
Hi, thank you for this fantastic talk. I actually just wanted to really, I mean, it's all related to what you said, but I actually wanted to talk briefly about renters and the lack of hearing that goes on towards renters and also about sustainability, the fact that renters have to continually move around because there is no protection, there is no sense of, long-term sustainable living in spaces that we come to occupy. And in my experience, and also to my own thinking about this, it's also very clear that people who marginalized groups, different people, and so on, they will start renting places because there is no. Doesn't seem to be real regulations around rent increases, literally every year. For some reasons, we have landlords and actually increase rents. And I don't understand where that's coming from because my wages are not increasing every year. I just don't get that sense of not only the increase, but also like, for example, in my current house, within a week of being there, I was already thinking, the next move because my landlord is someone that continually wants to move people along very quickly so that he can increase the rent even higher, right? And so there is no sustainability here. It's just people being continually forced out, and on top of it, every time they move, it costs a hell of a lot of money to move from one place to the other. And you just continue trying to manage when I go, people are finding ways that I can before because the costs are always higher and higher and higher and higher. So I don't see any protections in the law. I have not seen the Labour Party actually really doing anything in New South Wales to protect renters. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts around this policy. Thank you.
I have thoughts about renting. I think one of the really key issues, again, thinking about Housing Australia Future Fund, but also thinking about the mapping of support, is that there isn't a federal position on this. And so for a whole lot of people in the community who rent, they don't have protection. And one of the key issues for us is for older Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, housing precarity is largely contingent on renting. What have done, and also Housing Australia Future Fund have done, is really apportioned this kind of aspirational Aboriginal people want to buy their own home moment, instead of recognising that there are a lot of reasons why some Indigenous people are either not buying their own home or are unable to, or unwilling to, and instead it starts to shape how Indigenous housing is provided in the rental market. And how it shapes it is by making these assumptions that everyone wants to live the same. So that people want to live in the same areas as one another, that in fact they also want to, if they're older people, be living in shared facilities. So it doesn't allow autonomy or difference within that space. I think about it a bit because I'm thinking about queer old people in part of my project. And so I think this is a major issue, that being able to understand to not have basic renters' rights that go across the country is a major issue for us. That they are so diabolical at state by state and territory level is obviously, very clear. Again, if there was a national policy that addressed this, things like Close the Gap would also be able to address it. So, in a funny way, there's a lot of relationship between how provision of, any sort of form of social housing is provided and renters' rights in general, which we know would change if there was greater provision in social housing.
Hello. I'd just like to say some of my colleagues have been looking at housing as an infrastructure of care, and part of their argument has been about thinking about the shift of thinking about housing as a financial asset to a place of care. And the actual shift of that alters how potentially we can approach housing. If we were as a society to imagine housing not as something that we can profit from, but as something that is a human right that we all require access to, it would change the way rent systems work, legislation works. We would have changed capital gains tax and negative gearing legislation. That would be part of it because it would shift that financialisation conversation. I think their sort of argument around that is to really highlight that for people who live in places and they're renting, this is their home, and they need dignity in those places. You may be profiting from that housing, but we also need to be caring for each other rather than continually raising rents, etc. So that's part of that argument.
Yeah, and I might just briefly add that, starting where I started in my keynote is that housing is complicated. It's not single. So when we talk about housing and housing affordability, we talk about first time owners, we talk about renters, we talk about investors. There's multiple stakeholders in the housing system, and they all need kind of bespoke responses and ultimately coordinated responses as well. I am conscious of time.
Thank you, Sandy. One thing that is into my mind as I was listening to the presentation was the challenge, the demographic challenge that we are facing, and how the demographic challenge impact on housing. As you rightly mentioned, offices and aging place, and the need to having accessible place. And in this line of connecting everything around from this perspective, I'm also thinking in housing. A couple of weeks ago, I heard from an institute that looked at this part of housing. There was a proposal to build new units with less parking facilities. But in the context of an educated society, how viable it is to have, yes, we want to have more use of public transport, but unfortunately we can hardly do a public transport facility. Therefore, some people is limited how desirable it is to actually include all these policies and perspectives in the design of this and in the design process, because our society is changing. And as you say, those who love encouraging, not demand, perhaps this is something that we need to consider from the perspective of how much we need to work in population to remain active in society, and how well connection and housing can be in balance to provide better solutions. So I would say we have one to tell us about demographic issues and the need to rethink our housing needs.
I can speak briefly about this in relation to care. So the Committee for Sydney released a report about raising the care factor last year and sort of highlighting the fact that a lot of the people involved in home-based aged care and in the care sector more broadly commute really long distances from west to southwest Sydney, where the housing is more affordable, to the places where there are ageing populations and there's actually a deficit of carers, but also housing is affordable for carers, and it's a really complicated sector. But I think part of that sort of raises the question of how we do just make housing affordable for key workers, for people involved in aged care, childcare, education, health, etc., in order to ensure that we can care for people as they age in place. The question of transportation is really an interesting one. One of the ideas I've had about how to increase the per capita provision of public space, which is the gold bullet, is about sort of thinking differently about car parking. But as you note, particularly in a place that doesn't, and there's a whole range of reasons why people are reliant upon private transportation in the society we live in at the present, people do really rely on that form of transportation as they age. So I think we need to be thinking about those demographic changes to integrate the aging population narrative and the needs of different groups into the conversation about how we design housing, how the policy works, but also that relationship with care workers and with the people who are providing, giving and receiving care, and those questions around accessibility.
Thank you, Miriam. I'm very conscious of time, but just in terms of the transport housing question, I think it's one of the big issues, right? And coordination is needed. And there might be somebody in the audience that can confirm this, or maybe doesn't want to confirm this, but I was told that when the transit-oriented development program was announced by the state government, without any consultation, other government agencies didn't know it was coming. So transport didn't know it's coming, education didn't know it's coming, health and so forth didn't know it's coming. So there is this need for coordinated coordination, right? And something like strategic plan does that. The Greater Sydney Commission is in some ways supposed to do that, which has since been dissolved by the current government. So there are, there's some really big coordination things that need to be done. So we do have a couple of minutes, or 1 minute. So there was one question that came from the audience that I want to ask each of our panelists for a very quick one-line kind of response. So the next New South Wales election is coming up next year. So if you could advocate for one policy position to improve housing, what would it be? Start with you, come back to me.
One line response. I would say ensure that there is a green infrastructure strategic plan that operates at the state level, and all housing developments must be aligned and consistent with this green infrastructure plan.
Miriam?
Consider care in the way that you plan, and also consider the importance of public space at the same time as housing provision.
Well, my one's, I mean, actually maybe a wild card here, but I think land release for not-for-profit housing authorities or organisations. I think land release for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups, and that doesn't happen at the moment, is outrageous.
And I guess from my perspective, I think There is a need to pick up how that's used in some of this space. But I think there's kind of returning to where we started this evening. This needs to look beyond short-termism. You know, this idea that the housing crisis is something that's immediate. You get back to thinking about some of those longer-term visions and strategies and plans. So, you know, personally, I think the greater city solutions is a really useful idea in coordinating and delivering some of that. And perhaps that's something that the government might want to reassess moving forward. So I just want to wrap up there. I want to say thank you to, first of all, to Sandy, Miriam, and Paul for this evening and providing various really insightful contributions and partaking in the conversation. And then to everybody here tonight, thank you very much for joining us on the Macquarie campus tonight. The evening has been recorded and we'll share that with you early next week, so please keep a lookout for that. And we look forward to seeing you again at potentially other Arts After Dark events and other events run by the university. So thank you very much. Have a good evening and we'll see you later.
Yeah, I think it's really